Hello and welcome to your lecture on Babylon, Hammurabi, and law. Grab your student notes and use them to follow along and fill in any blanks that you missed in class. If you ask the average person off the street about the ancient world, they probably won't recognize the city names of Ur or Uruk or Eridu. But mention Babylon and a light will switch on. Babylon is one of the most famous cities in the ancient world, but it wasn't always famous. In fact, when it began, it was a pretty humble place. When Babylon first enters the historical record, it is as a small city to the northwest of Kish, Sargon the Great's hometown. You can see Babylon here and Kish here. Babylon was ruled by the Amorites, a people who had invaded from the west. The word Amorites, in fact, means Westerners. But when the people who were living in Babylon had to look up to their new Amorite overlords, they were not pleased. The reason is that while in Mesopotamia, the agricultural revolution was in full force, people had given up their nomadic hunter-gatherer ways in favor of farming and living in cities. The Amorites were still tent-dwelling nomads. They owned only what they could carry, and they moved around. And as a result, the Mesopotamians thought that they were barbarians. How can they rule over us? They said they're not even civilized. They're tent-dwelling nomads who eat raw meat. Ew! Now, I don't know about you, but if I were an Amorite and I just conquered a city and some upstart Mesopotamian was criticizing my way of life, I might feel a little bit resentful. But if the Amorites felt resentful, they hid it very well. Instead, they looked with keen, appraising eyes at the Mesopotamians' way of life, at their cities, their houses, their professions, like being a potter or a weaver, and they thought, hey, that actually looks pretty appealing. So very quickly, the Amorites adjust and adapt to the Mesopotamian way of life. They adopt Mesopotamian customs, their culture, their gods. Before long, you can't really tell who was born an Amorite and who was native to Mesopotamia. As a side note, it might be interesting to you to know that Abram and Sarai, later Abraham and Sarah, that famous married couple from the book of Genesis, are thought to have been Amorites. This is in part because their names, Abram, Sarai, and then Abram's father, Terah, are Amorite names. And also because the setting and facts described in the book of Genesis fit very well with this time period. As I mentioned, Babylon was a small city, but it was a small city destined for greatness. And that destiny was fulfilled with the advent of King Hammurabi, who turned Babylon from a small city into the political and cultural heart of Mesopotamia in the 18th century BC. And it remained the political and cultural heart of Mesopotamia for more than a millennium, more than 1,000 years. When I say it was the political heart of Mesopotamia, I mean that is where the seat of power was. You want to know where the government is? You want to know where the rulers are? Look to Babylon. And when I say it was the cultural heart of Mesopotamia, I mean it is the place where art and music and literature and religion had their greatest innovation and development. So if you were an artist or a writer or a musician, you would look to Babylon for inspiration. The great King Hammurabi ruled from 1792 to 1750 BC. He became king of what was then a small kingdom, Babylon plus a few little city-states, when he was only 18 years old. But by the time of his death in 1750 BC, he had conquered all of Mesopotamia. King Hammurabi was many things, but an underachiever was not one of them. Now you might be thinking, wait a minute, he conquered all of Mesopotamia. Didn't Sargon the Great already do that? He did. But do you remember when Sargon died? 2279 BC. That's a full 487 years before King Hammurabi began to rule. Between the time of Sargon's death and the beginning of King Hammurabi's rule, there was plenty of time for the empire that Sargon had founded to disintegrate. Remember, his dynasty lasted for about 157 years, not 487. So by the time Hammurabi became king, Mesopotamia was once again not united under an empire, but instead a conglomeration of various city-states, each with their own government and rulers, each of them fighting with the other, trying to get resources and land. There was plenty of opportunity to build an empire, and King Hammurabi was not one to let an opportunity slip by. As ruler, King Hammurabi took his responsibilities very seriously. He was deeply religious, a dedicated ruler, and an excellent warrior. You had to be if you were going to be conquering and creating an empire. However, although he had many accomplishments, his most famous was the creation of a law code which was once thought to be the earliest in human history. Since then, we have found others that are even earlier, but none that are as complete or as long-lasting as Hammurabi's law code. Here is a picture of that most famous law code. This copy was engraved on a stone stele, a stele being one of these tall, rounded blocks of stone with pictures of writing engraved upon it. 282 laws were engraved upon the stele in Akkadian. Akkadian was a language that everyone spoke back then, so that anyone could read the laws of Hammurabi as long as he was literate. Now, many people were not literate. That means they could not read or write, but they could still get the gist of what was going on by looking at this picture at the top of the stele. In this picture, Hammurabi stands in simple robes and humble before the seated Shamash. Shamash was the sun god, and he was the one in charge of justice, because of course the sun sees everything. Why do you think most crimes are committed at night? In this picture, Shamash hands the symbols of his power, his rod and his ring, to the humble Hammurabi. In other words, the sun god, the god of justice, is handing his power over to Hammurabi. He's saying, Hammurabi, you are such an honorable and just man that even though you're human, I feel like I can entrust my job to you. You can pass laws just as well as I can, so go ahead, make a law code. Anyone looking at this picture would have understood that Hammurabi had divine permission to create laws, and they had better well follow them. Most of the laws of Hammurabi follow an if-then format. For example, if a man should blind the eye of another man, then the authorities shall blind his eye. Because of this if-then format, and because of the extreme specificity of some of the laws, many people believe that the laws of Hammurabi were not something that Hammurabi just sat down and thought up one night, but instead were records of actual judgments of actual cases that were written down to serve as a reference for future cases. In other words, in the case of the blinding the eye law, at some point during King Hammurabi's reign, there was a case where a man had blinded the eye of somebody else, and it was decided that he should be blinded in turn, and that law was then written down and engraved upon the stele so that in future cases where one person blinded another, the judges would have something to reference so they could say, oh, well, in this previous case, the person who blinded somebody else was in turn blinded, so that's what we're going to do here as well. I mentioned the extreme specificity of some of Hammurabi's laws. Here's an example. If fire breaks out in a house, and someone who comes to put it out cast his eye upon the property of the owner of the house, and take the property of the master of the house, he shall be thrown into that fire. In other words, if the firefighter who comes to save your house decides he likes your couch and decides to steal it instead of putting out the fire, then that firefighter is going to be burned up in your house. That is a pretty specific case. That's not the sort of law that you think of just lying awake at night trying to pen laws. Instead, probably at some point, some greedy firefighter decided to steal somebody else's stuff, and a judge had to figure out what to do to him. And the results? Well, chuck him into the fire too. That then serves as a reference so that if there are any other greedy firefighters in the future, we can know to burn them up too. The Code of Hammurabi influenced law codes for over a millennium, over 1,000 years, and some of the concepts in it lasted even longer. For example, the lex talionis, which is the idea that the punishment should fit the crime, that the criminal should suffer the same fate as the victim. If you blind someone, you're gonna get blinded. The other enduring concept from the Code of Hammurabi is the presumption of innocence, the idea that you are innocent until you are proven guilty. In the time of King Hammurabi, accusers were required to provide witnesses and evidence in order for someone to be convicted of a crime. We've talked a lot in this class about the importance of standardization, that idea that when everyone does something the same way, it makes it easier on everyone. The standardization of a writing system meant that people could communicate with each other more easily. The standardization of weights and measures, making sure that everyone's pound weighed the same, everyone's foot was the same length, meant that trade, buying and selling, was a lot easier and a lot more fair. You knew what you were getting. Now with Hammurabi, we have the standardization of law. By writing the law code down and using it as a reference to judge cases, King Hammurabi was ensuring that people would be treated the same across the empire. It didn't matter if you were a greedy firefighter in Ur or a greedy firefighter in Kish, you were going to be thrown into the blaze either way. Standardization of law codes is something that we value today just as much as we valued it in King Hammurabi's time. All the laws for our country, our state, our local government are kept accessible to the public so that you can know exactly what is a crime, what is not a crime, and what the consequences are for committing that crime. Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, gave shape to our modern world. Beginning next week, we are going to be moving on to a new civilization, Egypt. Have a great week.